He wrote with ink. They answered with iron. The body broke. The silence didn't. Malemba Nzula was a Congolese student, a Marxist intellectual, and a member of the anti-colonial resistance under Belgian rule. In the early 1930s, he became the first black African to join the Communist Party of Belgium, openly denouncing imperial exploitation in Central Africa. His arrest was not for crimes of violence, but for speaking, too clearly, too truthfully. What followed was not a trial, but a slow collapse of body and mind at the hands of a colonial system designed to erase dissidents through pain. They remembered him first by his voice, not loud, not theatrical, but deliberate, clear, impossible to interrupt. Even in the echoing lecture halls of Brussels, where the air thickened with pipe smoke and colonial smugness, Malemba Nzula's voice sliced through like a scalpel through gauze, bloodless, precise, exposing the raw tissue beneath every European platitude. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not posture. He told them what they didn't want named, that Congolese hands bled so Belgian clocks could tick, that black bodies burned so white cathedrals could glitter, that the crown was built on severed tongues and children without arms. He had grown up in the Belgian Congo, in a village where silence kept people alive and language could kill. But he had always spoken, first in whispers, then in full-throated refusal. His brilliance had been undeniable, even to those who despised it. By the time he was 20, he was writing in French in Kikongo with equal force. By 22, he was accepted to a South African university, where Marxist thought first sank its hooks into him, not as dogma, but as a skeleton key to understanding the machinery of brutality around him. From there, he crossed oceans. Europe welcomed him, briefly, as long as he behaved like a curiosity, civilized savage, parroting Western ideas in an African voice. But he betrayed their expectations by doing the one thing they could never forgive: he thought for himself. He joined the Communist Party in Belgium in the early 1930s, but his speeches veered beyond party lines. He wrote pamphlets exposing forced labor in rubber plantations, illustrated with interviews smuggled from missionaries too horrified to remain silent. He named names, colonial officers, Catholic institutions, shipping companies, and submitted it all to Brussels journals. His writing was lucid and damning, filled not with metaphor but documentation, hours worked, bones broken, arms severed for missed quotas. His most notorious phrase, printed in a tract passed among Congolese students in Ghent, read, "Belgium is not a mother, but a butcher with silk gloves." That sentence marked his death, though he still breathed for months after. The first surveillance came quietly. A classmate failed to return a book. A janitor lingered too long near the residence hall. Letters began to arrive opened, resealed with damp glue. One night, his scheduled speech at a university forum was postponed due to a plumbing failure. The next morning, a man with pale hands and a priest's patience approached him outside a bakery and asked, gently, if he might be willing to speak privately with government officials about concerns of influence. Malemba refused. 2 weeks later, in the early hours of a rainless May morning in 1933, a burlap sack was pulled over his head as he stepped into the hall outside his rented apartment. He dropped his briefcase, which burst open on the stairs, papers spilling like entrails, essays, letters, a notebook open to a quote by Karl Marx written in careful ink. Neighbors later said they heard nothing. Only the slam of a door and a metallic sound, like a hinge coming loose or a chain snapping tight. No police report was filed. The university was told he had returned to the Congo. The Communist Party published a statement calling for information. The Belgian authorities denied any knowledge. In truth, they had buried him, not in dirt, but in concrete, beneath an old government building that did not appear on maps. There, they began the slow process of dismantling his voice. The mouth that had spoken read was to be unlearned, unsound, unmade, not with argument, but with water, wire, silence, and time. He would not be the first to vanish in such a way. But he would be the last whose words burned even after his body was cold. There was no air, only damp. It clung to the skin like rot, soaked through the lungs like oil, and settled behind the eyes like a second darkness. The walls, limestone, ancient, molting in layers, bled thin trickles of water down their pockmarked flanks, the same yellow-brown hue as the phlegm Malemba coughed up each morning onto the stone floor beneath his cot. Though cot was too generous. It was a warped wooden plank, slick with mildew, its edges gnawed by time and rats, its center permanently darkened by the weight and seepage of previous occupants. The smell rising from it was not quite human, but hinted at what once had been, a sweetness turned sour, a musk buried beneath decades of sweat and despair. Malemba had been here, or thought he had, for 9 days, though time no longer arranged itself in reliable shapes. The light overhead, a single rust filament bulb half encased in iron mesh, flickered according to its own cruel rhythm, not a steady pulse, but a stuttering series of false dawns and sudden blackouts, jerking his body awake or stranding it in hallucinated midnights. Sleep, when it came, was not rest, but collapse. The cold was deep and unrelenting, not the cold of weather but of stone, of marrow leached by centuries. The ceiling sweated at all hours. The floor sweated too. The walls were wet with breath that did not belong to him. Each day, though the word had lost all meaning, the door scraped open only once. There were no voices, only boots. A basin of water slid across the floor, sloshing a reddish-brown fluid that tasted of iron, rust, and old coins. With it came a shallow metal bowl of paste, lukewarm, chalk-colored, flavorless except for the grit of unmilled husks and something faintly sour, like spoiled milk laced with ash. He ate because the body insisted, but not with dignity. His fingers, once clean and strong, now trembled as they scooped the pulp from the corners. He never dared speak. Early on, he had murmured a prayer, a whisper of home, and the door had opened again, not with food, but with gloved hands and a baton. Silence, it seemed, was the first rule of survival. His skin changed first. It cracked along the knuckles, the lips, behind the knees. Tiny fissures opened across his shoulders like a parched riverbed. He could smell himself, not as he once had after long days of work, but like an animal dying in a trap, sour, stale, sickening. By the 5th or 6th day, or was it longer? His gums bled when he bit down on his own tongue to stay awake. He stopped seeing clearly. Or rather, he saw too much. The rot stains on the walls, long brown streaks shaped by old water and older blood, began to move. One dripped upward, slow and deliberate, until it pooled against the ceiling and formed a crude circle, not quite a face, but something with teeth. Another stain widened across the far wall into the shape of a woman kneeling, her hands clasped in prayer, her face smeared like melted wax. At first, he closed his eyes. Then, he opened them again, because the images followed him inward. When he urinated, it came out hot and red, and steamed briefly against the cold stone. He stopped counting how many times he vomited. His fingers blistered, then split, the skin peeling back in translucent ribbons, revealing pale flesh beneath speckled with black dots that looked like mold. He whispered to himself in Kikongo, then in French, then in a language he didn't recognize. Somewhere in that place, inside the bulb, inside the walls, maybe under the slab, something whispered back. Never words, only the sound of breath drawn through rotted teeth. He began to hum. Not songs, but single notes, held too long, cracked at the edges. It made the guards nervous. On one occasion, when they opened the door and saw him standing upright, eyes fixed on the rusted pipe in the ceiling, hands outstretched, they muttered something in Flemish and shut the door faster than usual. Later that night, a priest walked by the cell. Malemba didn't see him, only heard the low murmur of Latin, and then a hurried retreat. No blessing. No rites. Only fear. At some point, he scratched something into the wall with a shard of bone, perhaps a rib from some unidentifiable scrap in the gruel, perhaps from his own body, for lines in tight, shaking script. The next day, it had been scraped away. But the lines were burned behind his eyes. One said, "He is under the floor." Another, "He drinks the damp." They were not trying to kill him. Not quickly. Not loudly. They wanted the voice broken, not the body, not yet. He understood now. This was a place made not to punish, but to unmake. To decompose without death. By the end of the 2nd week, Malemba no longer wept. His tears had dried up with his words. But when he pressed his ear to the floor, he could still hear it, something beneath the stone. Breathing. Slow. Patient. Waiting. The first time they entered the cell with intent, not to feed, not to mock, but to begin the work, there was no word spoken. 2 men, dressed in matching gray aprons that hung stiff with dried fluids, stood at the threshold and regarded him as one might a carcass not yet skinned. Their eyes were devoid of curiosity, only calculation. Behind them, a third dragged a stool, its legs groaning against stone, and atop it, a coil of thin iron wire gleamed in the half-light like wet hair. Malemba did not move. He had learned that movement only quickened pain. They took his wrists first, brittle now, bones rising beneath paper-thin skin, and bound them tight, not with rope, but with that wire, the edges of which bit deeper the more it was twisted. When they hoisted him upward, pulling his arms over his head and fixing the wire loop to a rusted hook embedded in the ceiling, he did not scream, not immediately. Only when the weight of his body tore his shoulder sockets open with a slow, deliberate pop, did the sound escape him, a guttural howl, cut short by the sudden shock of breathless agony. His legs kicked blindly, scraping his heels against the stone, leaving streaks of skin and blood in their wake. One guard timed him with a watch. 9 minutes before unconsciousness. They let him hang for 17. When he came to, he was crumpled on the floor, arms splayed unnaturally behind him, wrists swollen to twice their size, hands useless. His mouth had been stuffed with cloth soaked in vinegar, the acid stinging open sores on his gums, the smell clinging to the back of his throat like smoke from burning flesh. The cloth was tied in place with another wire that carved a deep red line across his cheeks and around his head. He choked on it more than once. When he began to retch, they tightened the knot. This was not interrogation. This was instruction. The next day, they brought the splinters, thin, jagged fragments of which sharpened at one end and coated in some black substance that smelled of tar and rotting leaves. One by one, they forced them under his fingernails, pressing until the nail bed split and dark blood bubbled out around the intrusion. Then they waited. Let the rot set in. By the third day, his fingertips oozed a pale yellow pus, and the skin around each nail throbbed with fevered redness. The pain did not ebb. It grew, constant, gnawing, waking him from blackouts with a pulsing rhythm that aligned with his heartbeat. On the 5th day, they stripped him. He had not been naked before these men, not since birth, and yet now, as they pulled the soiled shift over his head, they exposed more than his body. Malemba shivered not from cold, but from something deeper, older, the ancient shame of powerlessness. They forced him to kneel. Made him recite lines written in French, "I denounce my homeland. I reject the disease of Marxism. I pledge my mind to the crown." But the words would not leave his throat. His jaw ached from prior binding, his tongue was cracked and swollen. He tried to speak, but the sound was a rasp. So they shocked him. The device was small, no larger than a pistol, with 2 metal prongs at the end and a rubber tube snaking to a battery just outside the door. When they pressed it to the space beneath his ribs, the current struck like lightning in slow motion. His body buckled forward and seized, muscles contracting in cruel harmony, spine bowing like a snapped branch. He collapsed, voided his bladder, and twitched in the puddle. His skin steamed in the cold. They repeated this 3 more times. By the end of the session, patches of his hair had fallen out in clumps, leaving his scalp mottled with sores. His spine no longer straightened fully. When they dragged him back to the cot, he whimpered, not from pain, but from the small humiliations that lingered after, the wetness between his legs, the tremble he couldn't hide, the look exchanged between guards, as if confirming something beneath words. He did not speak again for days. But in the silence, he imagined. He saw a serpent, black, huge, coiled in the rafters, whispering down to him that pain was only a language, and all languages could be unlearned. He saw the Virgin, weeping in iron chains, her mouth sewn shut, her feet resting on the backs of colonial judges. He saw his mother's hands, cracked and rough, reaching for him, only to burst into ash. When the priest returned, summoned not by conscience but protocol, he stood outside the cell and made the sign of the cross. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He would not enter. Inside, Malemba lay curled, body shaking, mouth open, as if to speak again. But the words had turned to blood. The body does not rot quietly. It begins in the folds, where damp gathers, where linen never dries, where wounds fester unseen until their stench writes the truth in the air. Malemba's wrists, bound with wire too long ago to mark the days, had turned a shade no living tissue should bear, the color of coal soaked in bile, edged with a thin green rim where pus and rot met blood that had long since curdled. The skin around the bindings was no longer skin, but a blistered sheath that tore if touched and pulsed when left alone, alive with something not human. He urinated in stutters now, thick crimson thread slipping into the cold, collecting beneath the cot and forming a shallow basin of rust-colored film. His stool had turned black, tarry, near liquid, an unmistakable sign to any physician of internal bleeding, but no doctor came. Only the guards. And even they, once indifferent, now entered the cell with sleeves pulled to their noses and faces turned sideways, as if fearing that direct eye contact might invite whatever lived inside him to leap. A sore had bloomed on his lower back, unnoticed until it burst with a sickening pop that soaked the mildewed cot with a streak of brownish-yellow discharge. Ants found it first, a long line of them threading in from a crack in the wall, crawling up the leg of the plank and disappearing beneath his sagging frame. He tried to brush them off, but his fingers, curled and trembling, barely obeyed. When he cried out, it was not in pain but in confusion, a sharp, infantile wail, as if he had awoken somewhere unfamiliar and been stripped of language. And indeed, something had shifted inside him. He began to speak to the wall across from his cot, not muttering, but conversing. He called it Mama. Whispered to it in Lingala, voice dry and halting at first, then fluid and intimate, as though repeating bedtime stories from long ago. At times, he wept and pressed his lips to the mold-streaked stone, murmuring apologies. Other times, he chuckled, soft and rhythmic, a private joke shared with the plaster. When guards banged on the bars, he didn't flinch. He only looked up and whispered, "Shoo. She's sleeping." One evening, when the flickering filament overhead died entirely and the corridor was left in utter black, they heard him reciting poetry, not in his own words, but M. Césaire, the syllables distorted by his swollen tongue, spoken like scripture. His voice cracked on every line, thick with phlegm and blood, but he did not stop. Je suis la bête, je suis le homme, he rasped, over and over, until the words lost meaning and became moans. But it was the laughter that unstrung the men assigned to watch him. It began without warning, a low hum. Then a rising chuckle, then full-bodied convulsions that shook the cot and echoed through the stone corridor. They reported it lasted nearly an hour. One guard swore he saw the shadows in the cell move, bending in ways that defied the bulb's position. Another left his post and refused to return. "He's talking to something," he said. "And it's talking back." At night, Malemba sometimes shrieked without prelude, pointing toward the pipe in the ceiling and sobbing, "It bleeds, it bleeds, it bleeds." They checked the pipe once. Found nothing. But a week later, it began to drip, not water, but a black, oily sludge that smelled of copper and mold. The priest, called again, refused to enter. He muttered a psalm at the threshold and backed away, his crucifix clenched in white knuckles. Still, the order from above was clear. No premature death. No mercy by accident or madness. His destruction had to be seen, recorded, public, symbolic. His body could collapse, yes, but only when the crowd could watch it fold. So they waited, even as the cell became a mouth of its own, breathing rot, whispering disease, holding him in its jaw. Malemba, by now, did not notice. He had grown quiet again. But when a rat crawled onto his chest one night, sniffed at the open wound by his collarbone, and began to chew, he did not move. He smiled. The procession began without ceremony, without announcement, without even a word spoken between the guards who entered the cell, just the scrape of iron on stone as the door opened, and the sharp, cloying bloom of torchlight illuminating what the flickering overhead bulb had long refused to show, a human figure reduced to wreckage. They found Malemba curled like a larva on the cot's edge, his knees drawn up, spine bowed, limbs bent by weeks of neglect into shapes that no longer aligned with anatomy. His body was naked save for a strip of cloth clinging to his hips, soaked through with stains, blood, urine, a black residue seeping from an unhealed sore above his pelvis. His right eye, swollen shut days ago, now bulged outward, the skin around it tinted yellow-green and hot to the touch. His mouth hung slightly open, as if he had begun a final sentence and forgotten it halfway through. When they grabbed his ankles, he did not stir. Only when they dragged him fully from the cot, his back scraping along the stone, a long smear of dried pus and blood left behind, did his breath catch in a thin, wheezing gasp. The corridor was colder than the cell, wide enough for echo, and long enough for cruelty. With each pull, his heels caught the edge of the uneven stones, toenails cracked, split, peeled. The right one, already dark with rot, came off completely near the fourth archway, left behind like a discarded tooth. His head thudded against each worn step, slow and rhythmic, until a thin halo of blood bloomed across the back of his skull. One of the guards made a joke about bells. The other stayed silent. By the time they reached the chamber, his breath came in uneven gulps, the sound of a dying animal caught in a pit, not pleading, not protesting, just existing at the threshold of what pain still registered. They hoisted him by the arms, joints loose, shoulders distended, wrists weeping where the wire had been, and slumped him into a wooden chair. It was not made for comfort, but display, tall-backed, nailed to the floor, with iron rings at wrists and ankles. His legs dangled. His head lolled forward, chin resting on a chest that rose too shallowly to be called breathing. When one guard tied his arms into position, the bone beneath the skin of his forearm snapped with a dry, muted pop. Malemba flinched but did not cry out. The room filled slowly, not a crowd, but a court. Uniforms. Observers. Functionaries. All faces made of stone, though the stench from the prisoner preceded him by yards. Sweat gone sour, rot mingled with excrement, blood congealed in the groin and underarms. One clerk pressed a perfumed kerchief to her nose. Another, a boy no older than 20, turned pale and excused himself to the hallway, where he retched behind the stone arch. The priest entered last, his cassock pristine, hands gloved. Eyes scanning the room but never resting on the chair. He opened a folder and began to read, voice level, almost bored. Malemba Nzula, formerly of Leopoldville, charged with incitement, atheistic sedition, and acts contrary to the glory of the crown and the sanctity of the church, the words tumbled forth like ash, rote, mechanical, drained of meaning. The prisoner did not respond. His eyes, both now sealed shut with swelling and discharge, offered no resistance, no acknowledgement. His lips moved once, or seemed to, but nothing emerged except the sound of wet breath filtering through thick mucus in his throat. The indictment continued, each line a formality stacked on an already broken spine. The sentence was read with sudden clarity, like a bell rung at the end of Mass. This man is declared an enemy of the crown. Unfit for release. His execution shall be one of time, not blade, death by deprivation. Let no blood be spilled that the crown does not command. No one applauded. No one protested. The priest closed his folder. The torchlight flickered against the sweat on Malemba's ribs, the glint of infection around his ankle, the steady drip from his jaw. The court cleared. One guard remained behind to untie the shackles. He hesitated, just a moment, when he touched the prisoner's arm. The skin beneath was hot, rubbery, alive with something beneath the surface. The guard did not speak. He averted his gaze and called for help. They dragged him back the way he had come, his head bouncing again against each stone, this time, with blood already flowing. His hands, stiffened now, trailed behind him like useless wings. Back in the cell, they dropped him unceremoniously on the cot. The door slammed shut. Darkness returned. He did not move. But later that night, when the bulb above flickered on again, weak, stuttering, something in the cell shifted. A faint murmur. A laugh, perhaps. Or a prayer. By the final stretch of that long death, not hours, but a decay stretched thin across uncounted days, Malemba's body no longer resembled anything that could rightly be called a man. His limbs had surrendered their structure, the flesh of his thighs turned to something soft and gelatinous, like fruit left too long in the sun. When pressed, it did not resist, but molded inward with a sick wet sound, leaving behind a print that did not rise again. His calves had thinned into ropes, the muscles eaten from beneath, while his knees swelled disproportionately, two infected knots beneath paper skin. His abdomen, bloated and distended, ballooned in grotesque contrast to his sunken chest, which now formed a hollow cage of ribs wrapped in parchment flesh. Each breath, when it came, sounded like the last breath of someone else, wet, rattling, and slow, a sound that seemed to crawl across the stone more than echo. His skin no longer bruised, it wept. From the inner thighs and under the armpits, it oozed thin, yellow-pink fluid that pooled beneath his cot and soaked the rotten wood until the entire slab creaked when he moved, not from pressure, but from rot made mobile. No one entered the cell without covering their face. The stench, a blend of human rot, dried feces, bile, and open wound, did not cling to the air so much as invade it, leaking from under the door, creeping up the hallway, worming into the threads of uniforms. It smelled not of death, but of something still living, something that refused to finish dying. And worse still, it was changing. There was, now, a sour sweetness to it, the smell of fermentation and blood that had turned. One guard muttered, half-jokingly, that it was like standing over a barrel of spoiled communion wine. No one laughed. His teeth began falling out in slow procession. First, the molars. He would spit them onto the floor, dry, bloodless, silent, and line them up against the stone in a straight row, as if building a wall. Then the incisors. They came loose when he chewed nothing, when he spoke nothing, when he simply breathed. He placed them beside the others. By the time his last canine dropped, he had built a fence of 16 teeth, precise, pale, stained at the base, the only order left in his world. He stopped speaking entirely. Not a murmur. Not a gasp. Not a laugh. Just silence, more complete than any he had endured before, broken only by that wet exhale, that corpse breath rattling at the end of his lungs. His eyes, which had been swollen shut for days, opened again, not in comprehension, but with the blind, milky sheen of glass. They stared at the wall without blinking. He never looked toward the door. When they found him, or rather, when the stench became unbearable even for those 2 floors up, they entered with gloves, rags, and expressions not of duty, but hesitation. One brought a candle. Another carried a length of rope, though he did not say why. The door was stiff, the hinges swollen from moisture. It creaked open like the lid of a sarcophagus. He was curled on the cot in a position no child would sleep in, knees drawn too high, arms bent backwards at the elbows, his spine twisted so sharply that one of the vertebrae jutted through the skin, forming a pale spike dusted with black mold. His lips were torn. Both hands were shoved into his mouth up to the knuckles, fingers curled inward, as if trying to claw something from his own throat. Blood coated his chin, but it was not fresh. One finger was broken, bent back at an impossible angle, bone protruding through torn flesh, and embedded just past the tongue. They approached, but not too closely. There were no flies anymore. They had come, feasted, and left. What remained was silence, not empty, but watching. The body gave off heat, though he had stopped breathing. His final act had been this, to claw inward, to dig for something he had not spoken, had not written, had not surrendered. Not a confession. Not even a word. And yet, the face. On what remained of it, swollen, split, slack with the softness of approaching decay, was something too unsettling to describe cleanly. It was not a smile, not quite, but a curve at the corner of the mouth. Not triumph, not peace, not madness. Something else. Something defiant. And in the blank white of the eyes, some believed they saw reflection, not of themselves, but of something behind them. No one spoke. They did not bless the body. They did not log the hour. They did not notify next of kin. They simply sealed the cell. With brick. With lime. With silence. As if trying to contain what he never said. Malemba's death was not announced. Belgian authorities buried him in an unmarked grave, but his writings circulated underground in pamphlets and through Marxist circles in Europe and West Africa. In the following decade, anti-colonial movements cited his name as a martyr, not for violence, but for clarity. His memory became a rallying cry in student circles across Kinshasa and Nairobi. In 1960, Congo declared independence. Malemba Nzula was never officially recognized by the Belgian government. But his face was painted in murals, his words inked into textbooks, and his story whispered in prisons where other truth speakers waited. His torturers lived on, some promoted, but none returned to that cell.